Hello, friends. Welcome again to Cyber Sunday School. I'm Associate Pastor Joshua Smith, and I have with me today Dr. Tim Haller, who is the Clinical Director and founder of Cardia Collective. You may know them under the name of Sage Hill Memphis. They have recently become autonomous, and so I'm here with Dr. Haller. A lot of people call him Tim, but I've known him for so long because his son and I were college roommates, and so he's just always been Dr. Haller to me. I don't know if I'll ever get over that, but we're so glad to have him today. You may or may not know that we have a partnership with Cardia Collective at St. Patrick, where they provide coaching for us in how to be emotionally healthy and stable leaders. And we also do a lot of referrals of folks who need a little bit of extra care to Dr. Haller and his other licensed practitioners. And so we're so glad to have you here, Dr. Haller. Do you want to say anything about yourself or your family or by way of introduction?
I'm just glad to be here. I do remember you rooming with Seth in that little tiny apartment across from Creighton College, and that was a long time ago. Dang, you guys have all grown up.
Mm-hmm.
You have how many kids? 3, 4 kids? Three.
Yeah.
My son has 4.
Mm-hmm.
I have 5 grandkids. Dang, I've gotten old.
Yeah.
But no, I'm pleased to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
So glad to have you.
Yeah.
First, let's just do what you've taught us to do and throw the moose on the table.
Throw the moose on the table.
Why should Christians care about emotional health? I mean, isn't the heart, deceptive and wicked beyond all things? Like, why would we even try to engage that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Let me start with the first part. Why should we care about emotional health? And I just had this discussion with a men's group that I lead on Wednesday nights, because what we do as a culture is we tend to divide up the body, the mind, the soul, the spirit into different parts, like the spiritual self and the mental self and the physical self. And in reality, they're all just irrevocably, that's not the right word, but they're intimately connected. You can't say anything, you can't have a thought, you can't do anything that isn't simultaneously neurological, isn't simultaneously biological. Like every single thought you have, every single thing you do, every single feeling you have fires neurons in your nervous system, okay? You can't have a spiritual experience. You can't pray a prayer that isn't simultaneously biological. Neurons are going to fire in your brain, okay? You're going to be able to measure that in some way on an MRI. So every single thing that we do is both, at the one time, on the one hand, it's mental in some way, it's emotional in some fashion, it's spiritual in some fashion, and it's physiological in some fashion. So that's why we should care about it. It's because it is all part of who we are. It's just part of being a human. Mental health is all part of being human. Now, and then this question always comes up. You quoted that verse in Jeremiah 17, I think it is, right? That the heart is desperately wicked. Who can know it? I have a couple of answers to that. I don't know if we want to go into too much detail about this in some sort of exegetical fashion, but and I'm sure I would make a mistake on it theologically if I tried, but I do believe that the next part of that, if you keep reading that passage, it says that the Lord God searches the heart to reward and rewards those who do good and who do evil. And so at the very least, if we can't search it out and we aren't desperately wicked, the goal would be to submit to God searching that heart out, because He does. And so what mental health is about really is in many aspects is it's about telling the truth, and it's about surrendering to what is really going on inside of me, and putting that on display, throwing the moose on the table to the degree that we can, and allowing God that if you will, that opportunity in the presence of at least one other person, and maybe in a group of people, to open that up to ourselves, like search the heart. How many verses say that, right? Search me, O God, Psalm 139, and know my inmost thoughts. So there are other verses that talk about the heart too. So I think that's another reason why we do mental health work, is because we want to take that stuff that's hidden, that's deep down inside, that we've hidden for so many years from each other, like Adam and Eve did in the garden, and tell the truth about it.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So one of the things that dovetails with our sermon series right now, which is called The Art of Neighboring, and we're walking through 1 Peter, and this idea of mental or emotional health and kind of being a holistic person, is the intersection of our experience with suffering. And a lot of our desire to engage mental health care comes from like acute suffering.
Yeah.
And a lot of our desire to avoid it comes from the fear of suffering or engaging suffering that's been there.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about how, Peter says that suffering can be the will of God? How do we reconcile that with God's kindness?
Yeah, I have no idea. Let's go to the next question.
Is suffering avoidable?
Some suffering, in my experience, both as a mental health professional and as a human, can be avoidable, just because we might make wise choices as opposed to foolish choices. Some suffering happens because we make foolish choices, and that's the consequence of a foolish lifestyle. But in general, in this world, you will have tribulation. But be of good cheer, I've overcome the world. So yeah, there is suffering in this world that is unavoidable, both because of the suffering that Jesus predicted. Like, if they hated me, they're going to hate you. If they persecuted me, they're going to persecute you. There's that kind of suffering just for the gospel. But then there's other types of suffering that is like the rain falls on the just and the unjust. There's kind of suffering that comes just because we live in a broken, fallen world, and we're going to get toothaches, and we're going to get tonsillitis, and we're going to get COVID, and whether you're a Christian or not, we're going to have cancer, and we're going to have children who get diseases, and there's going to be death at the outside the life cycle, when it's supposed to happen, quote unquote. So those types of sufferings are going to happen. That type of suffering is going to happen. Now, I think one of the things that Peter, what is the verse? How does he say it, Peter?
In 1 Peter 3?
1 Peter, yeah.
He's talking at the end of 1 Peter 3 about how we end up suffering for doing good, but that it's better to suffer for doing good than for doing evil.
Yeah, and absolutely, no doubt about that. So suffering. Oh, you said about being the will of God.
Oh yes, right, yeah. So if you suffer, if it is the will of God, to bear it
right,
well.
Right. Yeah, I don't know. I used to think I know what the will of God meant. Like, I used to think I knew what it meant for God to will something, and therefore, because he's sovereign and he can do what he wants and all that, but at the same time, he holds people accountable for what they do and other people and so forth, and how to parse all that. I don't anymore. What I do know is that I can trust him. I know that he's good, and I know that suffering hurts.
Yeah.
And I also know this: mental health counseling and going through the process of therapy is not about rescuing you from your pain. That is not the primary task of mental health therapy. Some depression, anxiety, and other types of painful experiences can be healed, overcome, gotten to the point where they don't hurt you as much, but that's not the primary goal. The primary goal is to be more, ultimately, of what God made you to be in the first place. To be more of who you are before the suffering happened, or as a consequence of the suffering that has happened to you, or the pain, or the life you've lived that has been difficult. To find the meaning in your story that you've already lived up to this point, and then find out what the rest of your story is going to look like as you relate better to yourself, to God, and to other people.
Yeah. So in that passage, the really familiar verse is always be prepared to have an answer for the hope that is within you,
Yeah.
right? And the context of that is that people are seeing believers suffer in such a way that it's provocative. It looks different. That they bear their suffering in such a way that it's hopeful.
Yeah.
And then that becomes a witness, and then you can present the gospel to people.
Yes.
And so there's a kind of immaturity that looks at that and says, I'm going to need to, in some ways, like deflect or minimize my pain and sort of, grin and bear it so that people can see a good gospel response.
Right.
And you've seen those people who, people are like, oh man, he's such a rock. It was his faith, but they're really denying what's going on. They're denying the process of grief or whatever.
Right.
Like how do we reckon with that? Like what does it mean to bear our suffering with hope if it doesn't mean to minimize it?
Yeah. I like to just point people back to Gethsemane. If Jesus was suffering under the anticipation of beatings and torture and the cross, he knew what was coming, separation from his Father relationally. And if we didn't know it was Jesus, right, who was crying that way in the garden and praying the way that he was in the garden, those type of people that you're describing would probably have chided him. Come on, buddy. Don't be so emotional.
Man up.
Man up.
Yeah.
It's only going to be for a little while. Just chill, right? You can do this. What will people think if they see you crying like that?
Yeah.
But that's not what Jesus demonstrated for us, and we know who he was. We know he was divine. We know he was human, and yet he, one manuscript says he sweated, as it were, as great drops of blood. He cried out, "Father, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done." He cried hours and hours in that state, expressing his extreme discomfort, fear, loneliness, sadness, everything that a person might be experiencing if they were about to suffer the extreme pain, extreme loss, death even.
Now, on the other end of the spectrum, you have folks, and you especially see this in social media, where people are actually broadcasting every bit of that. So, Jesus he removes himself, he takes a few trusted friends, he expresses himself before his Father.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't, live stream the experience
Right.
on his Twitter page
On
or something
Facebook,
like
right.
that, right?
Right.
So how do we identify the appropriate moments to be able to share those things?
Yeah, and I think that's important too, that we that we have this concept of the levels of intimacy,
Mhm.
and that the deepest of our feelings, the most intimate of our feelings, are shared at the appropriate level of relationship.
Mhm.
If you look at Jesus's level of disclosure of his most deep, I keep going deepest, the only words I got, I run out of words. His deepest pain, his greatest expression of feelings, it was with 3 people,
Mhm.
right? And they fell asleep, but it was with him and 3 people, Peter, James, and John, right? But then he exposed more of himself, if you will, explored more and disclosed more to 12.
Mhm.
And then there was more expression of himself to the 70, if you would, and then maybe to the multitudes. So it is Jesus as a model for disclosure. And then before, here's another great example. If you think about what did he say what did he disclose to the people who were the farthest away from him, and that was his persecutors, his executioners. As a sheep before his shearer is dumb, opened not his mouth. He didn't even say a word.
Mm.
Okay? And he just let what happened happen to him without any sense of defense, without any word of what he was going through. He just went through it. And so we make a huge mistake by disclosing too much to people who are not really close to us.
Another pitfall that I think is especially relevant here is, we talk about there's this whole range of occasions for suffering. You talk about some of it is just our foolishness causes us to suffer.
Sure.
And sometimes it's our righteousness that causes us to suffer. Sometimes it's other people's unrighteousness, right?
Oh, yeah.
And what is, how do we gauge or calibrate our response to like unacceptable mistreatment? And is maybe the difference between harm and hurt helpful there?
Yeah. Yeah. I was just at a court sentencing today with a good friend of mine, or for a good friend of mine, for his wife. About 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, he was driving his taxi, and a young man hit him head on and killed him. So he was, clearly the victim, and the young man lived, and so he was sentenced today. And his wife now is left bereaved. They'd only been married about 2 years, I think, about 2 years. And they were hoping to have their first baby.
Mm.
They married late in life. She was 34, he was probably 40, never been married before. And they just, found each other late in life and thought, oh man, it's finally the time. We're going to be together, we're going to have this life, start having children. And 2 years into it, less than that, he's dead. Because of a random act of foolish driving. What do you do? That's suffering that she's now going to have and live in for the rest of her life. So the question is, how do you live with that? How do you process that? Was that the will of God? Was that, what does the boy deserve? What does the perpetrator deserve? What kind of sentence does he deserve? How do I deal with the pain of that? And do I forgive him? And if I do, what does that mean? Well, her decision is to leave the sentencing up to the courts. Whatever the law decides, she'll be okay with that. She hopes he finds Christ, if he doesn't already know him. And for her pain, she has friends and she has support, and try to make the most out of the life that she has left. And who knows what the future holds. She was just telling me this morning, I'm not a person who gets emotional, and she doesn't. She just doesn't express much emotion, but she feels things.
Mm-hmm.
She just has a hard time expressing them. That's part of the type of suffering. That's part of the being a victim who is harmed. You were talking about the difference between being harmed and hurt. She's hurt too, but that's being harmed. That's when someone has violated your rights, right? Being hurt is not necessarily the same thing. If I violate your right to life, or your right to have a husband, by taking him away from you, I have harmed you. If I hurt you, it may be simply that I have said something that caused you to feel pain, or I've done something that caused you to feel pain, which humans just do, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it may be a good thing. It may be something you needed to hear. Like, Josh, you have not been good to your daughter, or you've spoken something harshly to your wife. And I needed to tell you that. And you may be hurt, but you're not harmed. In fact, you might be better off.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. But when you harm somebody, you've crossed over into that other area of human experience. that requires almost another level of healing and forgiveness.
So it's reasonable to set boundaries to prevent people from harming you,
Yes.
but impossible to set boundaries to keep people from hurting you and still be in relationship
Right.
with other humans.
It is impossible.
Yeah.
I have a friend of mine who says you can't be in a relationship for 10 minutes without hurting someone.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of us, because of the way, we just don't like pain. It's just not a thing that we enjoy. We try and avoid it at all
I
costs.
don't like it.
And we develop coping mechanisms to be able to dull that pain, just anesthetize the edge a little bit. But our coping mechanisms seem not to be sufficient for this season. The things that worked before are not working now. We're seeing an uptick in divorce. We're seeing, just a whole lot of tension with people. Where do we go when our coping mechanisms aren't working anymore?
Yeah. I think that's fair to say, and I'm assuming you mean by the isolation, the COVID, and all this time of pandemic. Yes. Well, I think we have to admit that. So I'm really glad you brought it up, and so then we say, like, that's what's happening. We have to admit that's what's happening. There's so many people walking around or living in their relationships, living their lives, they're just moving ahead and doing whatever is next because their coping mechanisms aren't working. But they don't know that they've pushed something to another boundary. They pushed the boundary. You see what I mean? So like you said, there's an uptick in divorce, there's an uptick in drinking, there's an uptick in gambling, or there's an uptick in watching Netflix or whatever it is. What's that word for addictions? I don't know the English word for that. Process addictions. But they don't even know it. So let's have that conversation. Let's have that conversation. Like, speak out loud about that. What's going on? I have noticed that. Or talk to each other about it. I've noticed that about you. And I'm not trying to judge you, but I have noticed you've watched a lot more movies lately. Or maybe I think I've noticed you're drinking more lately. Or whatever. Not to judge, but to have those conversations. Let's talk about them out loud.
Which will hurt.
Which will hurt. Yeah, it's scary. And it's scary to notice it in somebody. It's scary to hear it from somebody else. That's one thing. That's another thing I think a person needs to do is to kind of lighten up on each other, like on themselves. It's like, we're in the middle of a pandemic, okay? Probably, it's safe to say that for all of us, if not the vast majority of us, we're in the middle of something we've never been in before. I don't know anybody who's been through this before. Not in my lifetime. I never had to wear a mask everywhere I went. I'm 61 years old. And I had to keep 6 feet distance between me and virtually everyone I'm in the presence of. And fearing that I'm going to give someone a disease or they're going to give me a disease every time I go somewhere. So that's a big deal, So let's chill a little bit. Give each other some grace. Give ourselves some grace. A little mercy. It's hard. This is hard. And then thirdly, I would say, talk about how hard it is. We at Cardia, of course, we talk about these 8 emotions here: anger, fear, hurt, sad, glad, shame, guilt. Did I get them all? Lonely. Thank you. And because, and this brings us probably full circle to the heart. And I don't know that this is what, when Jeremiah mentions the heart in chapter 17, I'm not sure he's referring to these emotions. But we call these the voice of the heart. Chip Dodd in his book, I have to mention that he's actually the one who coined the phrase, the voice of the heart. But when we refer to these emotions as what's going on inside of us, tell the truth. I'm scared. I'm lonely. I'm ashamed. I'm angry. Okay?
Mm.
And it makes it, and if we can do this with a group of people or even just a few people, it makes us less likely to need to do things that are escape oriented.
Mm.
We don't have to escape all the time because we're with people. I mean, we're escaping. It's a safe space to be.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
There's this phrase I used with my wife for years because she's very, in tune with emotional language. And for me, I've always been ESL, emotions as a second language. Like I kind of had to learn and translate
Right.
a lot of that. That's sort of a pandemic situation with Presbyterians too, right? We're all ESL. We're just figuring this out. Hyper rationalistic sort of people.
Okay.
So maybe somebody's watching this today, and some of this is resonating with them.
Sure.
And they're going, I think I might want to explore that. And what are my options? What do I do? Where do I go? Can you help them?
Yeah. Well, of course, everyone should come to Cardia and get mental health therapy.
Right.
Let's just put that on the table. No, there are options that are way short of therapy. And some people might need therapy, and I get that. And there are lots of therapists here they could see. But Voice of the Heart book is really worth reading. The workbook is worth going through, and you can do that with people. You can do that on your own to get started. There's also really good organizations out there where you can just meet with people for free. Right now they're probably all online. I'm pretty sure they all are, and that's like ACA or ACOA. We used to call it, now it's just ACA, Adult Children of Alcoholics. That's a group of people who come together to just support each other through the dysfunction of their lives that's caused by the dysfunction of their families.
Mm-hmm.
Basically all this says alcoholics, but you don't have to come from a family with an alcoholic in your childhood. So that's also a very helpful guide. And there are other books out there that are worth reading if you just want to read some books on the topic, just to get your brain headed in that direction. Besides that, The Soul of Shame by somebody whose last name I can't remember, also really good. On suffering, I can't but mention this because you brought up suffering. There's an excellent book called This Too Shall Last by KJ something. If you give me just a second, I'm reading it, but I can never remember her last name. Ramsey.
Okay.
KJ Ramsey. Excellent book on suffering from a Christian who is suffering. Basically, her whole adult life has been suffering from a physical illness that just came on her very early in her early adult life, and she has brilliantly captured what it means to live a life of suffering when God chooses not to rescue you. Oh my gosh. Every sentence is like, you just want to slow down and capture it and just marinate on it. Really good.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
This conversation feels like that to me. Just want to slow it down and marinate in it. It's just really, really rich, and I think going to be very helpful to people. So thanks for sharing.
It's been my honor. I love you guys. I love St. Patrick's Church, and everybody that I've met and had anything to do with out there. Just refreshes my soul just to be with you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay, Josh.
Bye.